How Among Us solves Danganronpa's core issue. In this video I will explain, then compare Among Us to Danganronpa, probably with annotations to skip to that part if you're familiar with both games. Then I will address an issue with Danganronpa, followed by how the gameplay of Among Us solves those issues. Keep in mind, I still believe Danganronpa is a really good game. It's one of my favorites, but it still has 3 or 4 things to learn from Among Us. What is Among Us? So finally I managed to play Among Us for the first time. Showing my age, I was completely confused and didn't know what to do. But the premise is simple enough. Among Us is described as a social deduction game. Whodunit for live players. Among Us is separated into 2 teams, the imposters and the crewmates. The crewmates can win if everyone completes all of their tasks. In every game there's at least 1 imposter, and the imposter's goal is to kill crewmates up until the number of imposters without being discovered. So if there are 10 crewmates and 2 imposters of that 10, the imposters would have to kill 6 crewmates so that there's 2 imposters left and 2 crewmates left. If a crew member discovers a dead body, they can report that dead body to the rest of the crew, which will trigger a discussion to figure out who done it. An imposter can also report a dead body to shake things up. The crew will then vote, and whoever is chosen by the majority vote will be ejected from the ship. It is possible to eject either the imposter or a non-imposter. If it wasn't an imposter that was ejected, the game will keep going, but it's also possible to skip the voting in the group meeting. The methods to finding out who done it are as follows. 1. As the imposter cannot complete tasks, they will at times fake doing a task to appear as though they aren't the imposter. If the imposter stands in front of an objective and the green bar at the top doesn't go up, they didn't complete the task, or some tasks have visuals when they are being done. At the same time, one can hit the emergency button for an emergency meeting, talk over the evidence with other members, and they may vote to eject that person. 2. Normal crewmates cannot use vents for fast travel, but the imposters can, so if someone sees someone use a vent, they are an imposter. 3. Imposters are also the only ones who can trigger ship malfunctions, such as the air supply lighting or locked doors. Spoiler alert. For Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc, just the first game. I implore you to play that game before continuing this video, as it's probably one of my favorite games of all time, and while I did thoroughly enjoy the game, it does have a couple of core flaws. It has to deal with its core gameplay loop. What is Danganronpa? Makoto Naegi is a student who is about to begin his first day to one of the highest prestige schools in the world that accepts only the very best, and only then of a particular profession, the so-called ultimates. Makoto only got in because he won a raffle, making him the ultimate lucky student. Makoto eventually walks up to the gates of the school and goes in. He doesn't find anyone there. He wanders over to a desk and eventually falls asleep. He wakes up to find cameras everywhere and everything bolted down. He then wanders into the lobby to find 14 other students. Sooner or later, they get called into the auditorium. A small bear announces the beginning of the killing game. The killing game is as follows. There is no way out of the school. Everywhere is completely locked down. Everything will be provided for the students, from food to clothes, etc. Comparison. Danganronpa and Among Us share several similarities, each being a murder mystery. In fact, I would even be so bold as to say that Among Us is a low-budget multiplayer-only version of Danganronpa. To compare them, I was watching Matthew Matosis, or Matt to be short. I bet his son's name would be Matthias Matosis, and his grandson Mather Matosis, each of them with the nickname Matt or Mama for short. Wonder if you guys can catch the reference. Anyway, he talks about how some players are mechanical introverts and others are mechanical extroverts when it comes to games.
This is basically pseudoscience, but I have a theory which explains differing reactions to these kinds of moments. Maybe you've heard the analogy that extroverts expend energy when alone, whereas introverts expend energy in the company of other people. Something similar is true for games. I'm a mechanical extrovert. I recover energy when I have full access to my moveset, and I'm placed in a scenario where I'm expected to make use of that. Conversely, I expend energy when freedom is taken away, because to me, this comes with a feeling of being constrained, along with a desire to break free from those confines. Presumably, some people are the opposite. They would expend energy in a combat scenario when there are many split-second decisions to make, then they would recuperate when put into a situation which has no failure state. As you might imagine, it's probably not that straightforward in practice, with different players having different tolerance levels or degrees of preference, and it's not as though there can't be any difference in quality between quiet moments either.
I'll let him explain it. Danganronpa is a single-player only game with no multiplayer and is heavily story-based. One has to find clues, but the meat of the gameplay lies within the class trials. The voting procedure in Among Us is similar to that of the class trials in the sense that it is a trial of peers and the one with the most votes gets ejected, but Among Us is done with actual peers instead of NPCs. So I imagine that a mechanical extrovert would prefer Among Us, and a mechanical introvert would prefer Danganronpa. So let's first describe the gameplay loop, which is the catalyst for the other issue. Gameplay loop. After the beginning introduction and exploring Makoto's room, the player gets to talk to the other classmates during free time mode. Eventually someone commits a murder, and then the class trial begins. When the blackened, or murderer, is chosen, they alone will be executed, and repeat. By as early as the third murder, one might have a solid grasp on the story and gameplay loop. Even though there are different ways the events of the story happen, the murders and subsequent class trials, it can be boiled down to the same gameplay loop. In this case, the game relies heavily on the nuances of its story in order to keep the player experience fresh. Not all gameplay loops are bad, just about every game has them, but after deciphering Danganronpa's gameplay loop, the player is likely to focus on the most high-intensity portions of the game. This will lead to one of our main problems: meta-ludonarrative dissonance. Ludonarrative dissonance is a conflict between the story's gameplay, or ludo, and the narrative, or narrative. For example, if the player character in a game were to be a warrior who swears to never kill anyone and is represented as such throughout the entire game, cutscene and story-wise, yet in the game the player is objectively killing people through combat sections, the gameplay contradicts the story elements. The player is playing a character excessively in a way that the character would not behave, nor is represented that way in the story. It may or may not be a problem due to how heavily the game leans on the story and the extent of that contradiction. I would accuse Danganronpa of something different: meta-ludonarrative dissonance. I would describe this as the player themselves changing in a way that disassociates themselves with the goals of the player character due to gameplay elements. The meta part I derive from metagaming, which is also especially a problem in a story-heavy murder mystery game. Metagaming is, to quote Wikipedia, metagaming is a term used in role-playing games which describes a player's use of...
Here in my garage, just bought this new Lamborghini here. It's fun to drive up here in the Hollywood Hills. But you know what I like a lot more than materialistic things?
real-life knowledge concerning the state of the game to determine their character's actions when the character has no relevant knowledge or awareness under the circumstances. An issue of metagaming in Danganronpa is to say that, especially if evidence points towards a particular person, the player would think that person is a red herring because it's never the first person who is expected, or solving cases using means other than the information present in the game. Not to say that every trial has this problem, because they don't, and thinking that way will actually cause one to get things incorrect at times. Ironically, in the completely organic Among Us, there will be times when you catch the imposter killing someone, and if the imposter types that the person who saw them did it first, the others will likely believe whoever gets the words out first, creating a similar issue. Outside of the main gameplay elements such as the class trial and chatting with other students, I imagine many people will also play this game for the story. It is classified as a visual novel after all. Because of that, and by nature of this also being a game, most people will want to progress that story. The inevitable murder is a high story element, leading into a class trial, which is a high gameplay element.
So in other words,
the murders in the school can become a means to an end for story progression and noteworthy gameplay sections, which may invoke in the player a sense of sadism, where they will want to see the other students die for the sake of progressing the story and thus their entertainment. Makoto Naegi is the character whose role the player is taking. Makoto by no means wants to see any murder take place. In fact, he often tries to convince people to keep calm and hold on to hope. Needless to say, he doesn't always succeed. What can be the highest point in the game for the player is actually the lowest point in the game for the player character.
Oh shit, here we go again.
This is meta-ludonarrative dissonance. I'm sure the developer's intention is for the player to interact with and bond to the other characters and feel empathetic towards their situation. After all, that's what free time events are for in the first place. Judging by how the story is written and the characters' backstories, one can infer that was the developer's intention. The class trial doesn't need to be the high point in the game, or rather, the only point of it. Among Us alternate win condition. As mentioned before, Among Us has a task system. With this task system, one could actually beat the game while only completing tasks. If the player is a crewmate and completes all of the tasks, along with the rest of the team, they win the game. Only it's kind of difficult to do from my gameplay experience. In other words, in Among Us, the players are incentivized to complete tasks via its in-game mechanics and are rewarded for doing so. If the player or crewmate can complete a visual task, it proves that they aren't the imposter, and the more crewmates there are, the more potential allies they can team up with. The crewmates are not rewarded for waiting for murders to happen, but there are several incentives to complete tasks. Point being, with each murder that takes place, the game gets consecutively worse for the crewmates. Their crew gets closer to losing as the win condition for the imposters gets closer to completion. Additionally, if a player is close to completing all of their tasks and a murder happens, the murder serves as an inconvenience rather than something to bring excitement, especially as any murder will interrupt the task. Not to say it doesn't bring excitement to anyone, but it's still a negative. As mentioned before, murders in Danganronpa can be seen as a good thing by the player, putting them at odds with the player character. Danganronpa would benefit if it had something similar to Among Us's task system. It could be some way to escape, real or red herring, that the player could constantly be working towards, not unlike the mini-games in Among Us or even Danganronpa's own school mode. School mode is post-game content which centers around crafting. It's like a resource management thing where the player commands the students, not necessarily from Makoto's perspective, to gather materials, and others to clean in different areas that have different items. After collecting materials, the students can build certain things. Something like this would be beneficial to the main game, probably with the addition of a timer system as well. A timer system that simulates day and night and emulates the multiplayer element of Among Us. Think of it like a reverse kill timer, perhaps emulating something like stress buildup or the desperation that tends to lead to murder. If one takes too long, the free time could extend to nighttime, where one would be more likely to uncover new items, but there would be other dangers along with that. This way, at least 1 or 2 murders can happen during free time, and depending on the player's actions at free time, depending on what and when the player was doing during win time, it could alter the difficulty of the upcoming class trial as well. Perhaps a murder happened at a certain time while chatting with another student, Now the player character has an alibi, and the upcoming trial will be shorter. Or the murder happened during nighttime, making the player more suspicious if they were out during that time, extending the trial length and increasing the difficulty. Incorporating a task system that facilitates teamwork and alternate achievable goals would turn the player from a potential sadist of the original Danganronpa into someone actively seeking out a way to escape or succeed through teamwork, as in Among Us. I'll give a better example at the end, but to visualize what I'm talking about, one could find a lockpick and then raise a relationship level with someone who knows how to pick locks, or someone else found a lockpick and the player needs to convince them to open something. The player and the other student go to a locked door together, and depending on the timing, a murder happens. Now both of you have an alibi, changing some things in the upcoming trial. Ultimately, another win condition would be solving the mystery of the school early, providing that certain characters are still alive, could easily allow for them to come up with a strategy to escape. But now we need different story routes to account for this if it didn't happen, leading to the next issue. Lack of variety in free time. Heavily story-based single-player games need not always have variety in choices, options, and endings in order to be good, but it is a flaw of Danganronpa due in part how its free time interactive mode is handled. As mentioned before, each and every character has several dialogue lines in the game. It works like this: seek out a character and the player can spend time with them. Afterwards, one can give that character a gift based on their personality. If it's a good enough gift, the player can continue the conversation with them and learn something new about them, as well as unlocking a new skill to use in the class trial. Each time the player spends time with someone, they use one of their limited free time slots. For example, in Chapter 1, there are only 3 free time slots available, with the highest at 5 in the next chapter. Several characters have 5 free time events. The total amount of all characters are 68 events, one away from the sacred number. You wouldn't even get through a third of them in normal gameplay. It isn't a completely terrible decision to force the player to choose to spend their limited time interacting with who they are most interested in. It adds a sense of urgency. Unfortunately though, there is a fatal flaw with this system. Most of these free time events have very crucial information about the cast in order to understand their motivations and personality. Some even give clues to upcoming murders and put them into context. But more importantly, it helps the player form a bond with these characters, which is really important if one is going to feel anything as a player when some of them die. Many of these characters I didn't even get a single free time event with, which if I did, it would have completely changed the way I viewed them in my first playthrough and contextualize how I felt when they died. It is important for the developer to be self-aware in order to gauge what the player would think in a given situation and make decisions in regard to the story and gameplay with those things in mind, as well as use that knowledge to elicit certain feelings from them. Part of what would be allotting time and nudging the player in certain directions. I can easily realize after playing the game, when most characters die, it is definitely meant to be the biggest, most awful, most tragic experience, especially coming from the perspective of characters in World, who are only high schoolers. But as the player, without getting the chance to know these characters more, it can be easy to become distant from these characters. It is regrettable that a lot of these characters are much deeper than most people would initially think, including myself, but most people will never know that in normal gameplay. With some characters, the player wouldn't even get through 2 of their dialogue lines as they die very early on. Only a select few of them are completable. The only way to get through them all is via school mode, which is post-game content. The caveat is unless the player is using a guide, it's still easy to focus on the wrong thing and only get a few more dialogue lines completed, leading to the grinding and completion of school mode several times. As mentioned before in my earlier video, most people don't even finish games.
I don't believe it! believe it!
So most people are definitely not going to play through the game 4 times or play through post-game content at least 2 or 3 more times. I can tell that most people don't do this anyway because a lot of them still believe that Sakura is gay. For the record, Aoi isn't either. This is something else that Among Us does well, something that Danganronpa could borrow from, the idea that things can happen differently in each playthrough depending on what actions the player takes, even if it has the same ending. In Among Us, no matter how many times one plays, even with the same group of people, the imposter is chosen at random, so one has to rely on different methods to both stay alive and catch the culprit. There are rules of the killing game that constrict what can or can't happen, that differ Among Us from Danganronpa, like a judge for example. The other restriction is that if the game itself has sequels, which it does, the amount of people alive has to line up with the sequels. However, because Danganronpa is text and a sprite heavy game with little animation, I don't think it would be that hard to have created branching paths in the next game, even if it's just side stuff for the characters that lived, especially if several of the characters are not important part in future games. Even so, this could still be circumvented with multiple endings and a true ending. Again, it is a horrible idea to lock more than 2/3 content containing crucial information to the story behind replaying the literal exact same game several times, or grinding out post-game content that most players will never try. Having multiple outcomes in a game, especially getting a bad ending, is a huge incentive to replay the game and get a few different new experiences as well as resources and information on the characters and their perspectives. That said, missing out on more than 2/3 essential content in one playthrough by game limitations is kind of steep. Additional content is fine, but that's way too much. Mid-video PSA, if you're playing Danganronpa, go through school mode after you finish and fill out all those report cards. I may not sound excited, but I put an exclamation point at the end. Trust. Trust is a huge deal for someone who is participating in a killing game where anyone around them could potentially give them a bad ending. In Among Us, the trust factor is based on one's actions. In fact, it's been described as a currency, or the most important factor in the game. Some people will get suspicious if you follow them. Others will get suspicious if you stand in the same spot for a period of time without doing anything. One's very actions as a crewmate, regardless of legitimacy, can actually get them falsely accused and ejected from the game by other crewmates. We aren't even going to mention false accusations by the imposter. This is something else Danganronpa can stand to learn from Among Us. While the trust system in Among Us is a natural part of the game, it is not present in Danganronpa from a gameplay perspective. Because Danganronpa is not a multiplayer game with live people, if it had a trust system, it would have to emulate the idea of trust. Imagine if winning over other characters through gifts and dialogue options, and even being near someone's side for a while, increased trust. But how would that trust affect gameplay? This leads to another problem, that problem being a true lack of a failure state. If one's actions in Among Us are sus, one will possibly get ejected from the ship, which is a pseudo game over. In Danganronpa, there is no real consequence for performing poorly in the trials, except for less coins. So if gameplay in free time mode could increase or decrease trust, it would directly affect one's performance in a trial, which could make the trial longer or shorter. Some things the player says would be believed more often than not if they had a higher trust, while the player would have to prove more things if they had a lower trust, lengthening the already long trials. At least in version 1, they're at least an hour in length depending on how certain you are in your answers. The trial itself would also affect the trust level. The more things the player got wrong during the trial, the more the trust gauge would go down. The more things the player gets correct during the trial, the more the trust gauge goes up. Having a low trust gauge should negatively impact the game overall. Certain characters will only talk to the player with a certain level of trust, and if no one believes the player, it could affect 1 or 2 more people dying and change the ending. I would completely scrap the current quote-unquote failure state in Danganronpa as well. No restarts. Earlier I mentioned how Among Us has a pseudo game over. I think Danganronpa should copy this. In Among Us, when someone dies, they turn into a ghost and can still complete tasks, but they can no longer participate in the group meetings or trial. Danganronpa can borrow this by heavily reducing Makoto's participation if one gets a quote-unquote game over. Instead of a game over, other characters will have a greater role in the trial, and the player will have a lesser role in it. In other words, other students would ghost Makoto. This would provide fewer chances for the player to regain trust during the trial. Ironically enough, during research for this video, I found Distrust, which is the prototype version of Danganronpa. It has a very similar method of using the trust system as I mentioned before. It's not implemented 100% the same though. To quote, "Tough decisions would occasionally prevent themselves, which would open up branching paths and alternate endings to the story. The choices made would influence the trust or distrust meter, and with a maximum trust level, a character would become your ally during investigations. The level of the meter would also determine which murders would occur." I also found a lot more scrapped content, unused murder scenarios with artwork and everything, unused executions, dialogue lines, endings, multiple character designs when unused. A lot of the different content that I found could be repurposed for such alternate endings, and they already exist. Ironically, again, this would make for a much better game. It makes me wonder why they would scrap it. There were also some good ideas with school mode as well. If both features from the prototype and features from school mode were implemented, it would make a much better game. It seems like they already knew. I wonder why they weren't implemented. End result. Danganronpa, borrowing some of Among Us's core mechanics, would sort of play like this. Skipping the introduction, fast forward to the first free time mode. Now there's more free time than before, and the free time is actually time. Take too long and it goes into nighttime mode. Exploring during nighttime can be more rewarding, but someone skulking around for a long time at night isn't so trustworthy, right? Secondly, there's more to do than just look for coins, get items, and talk to other students. Similar to school mode, it's possible to craft different things with the items found. One can also look for clues, openings, flaws in security, loose doors, trapdoors, out of reach areas, etc. Some areas to explore will only be accessible having a certain trust or relationship level with some characters, and then only if certain items are given to them. Give the swimmer a high performance swimsuit and she can swim to the bottom of the pool, finding a hard to reach secret or item. Give Sakura high performance boxing wraps and she can punch through certain walls, but maybe it would have to be done strategically. As a couple of examples, there may also be some puzzles or mini games potentially corresponding with whomever time is spent with. I can even imagine a Peace Walker style interactive cutscene mini game that use Mr. Game & Watch style pre-masked shapes that would cycle sprites from one side to another, including stealth at nighttime. For the record, not everything I mention is 100% necessary. They are just ideas of things that can be implemented, but in one form or another. Say that you befriend another character and they were originally going to make a bad decision, but instead, because of your relationship with them, they don't, and there's some kind of bonus for it, like additional cutscenes or dialogue or ending. Spending free time with characters will increase trust with that character, and spending time by oneself, solo exploring and the like, could potentially decrease trust, at least at nighttime. It is possible for at least a couple of murders to happen during free time, maybe some dynamic encounters depending on the location and time. When the eventual murder happens, it is possible to have an alibi by being with a character during a certain time period, reducing the time of some trials. But there is some necessity to venture out on one's own from time to time. The more the player answers correctly during the trial, the more trust increases for every character. Having high trust with multiple characters will make the trial shorter, allowing one to venture out at night with fewer issues and either delay some deaths or prevent some deaths entirely. Some characters that could die might have a very useful ability that if they survived, it could be put to greater use later on to get a better ending. The biggest, most awful, most tragic ending results from constantly answering wrong during the trial and having very low trust to the point when the final trial comes along, no one believes you and everyone ends up getting killed. In closing, this version of Danganronpa utilized Among Us's task system in order to expand gameplay options, with at least resource management, time management, alliances, dynamic encounters that require critical thinking, and maybe some puzzles and or mini-games, etc. that could reduce the amount of trials and allow the unlocking of additional content to incentivize gameplay outside of the fixation on the murders and class trials, heavily limiting the meta ludonarrative dissonance problem. It took advantage of Among Us's multiple possibilities by allowing for alternative endings and outcomes, borrowed the pseudo-failure state of ghosting so that the player would get ghosted by their classmates, creating a proper incentive for success, incorporates a trust system of teaming up with other players in order to form alliances, go on special missions, reduce trial lengths, prevent deaths, and get multiple endings. Outside of the first system, likely the most egregious, the other issues are multiplayer functions that cannot usually exist organically in single-player games, but are emulated for the sake of a better experience in them, like this version of Danganronpa. At last, I must say, despite the issues Danganronpa has, and the ones I didn't mention, I would still give this game at least an 80 or 90, 80 to 90 out of 100 personally. Its storytelling really helps carry the game. It also sets a really good mood. The characters are done very well. I still think about the characters, their motivations, etc. even months later. Some of the characters are also worthy of a 30-minute video, but it could have been done so much better had it innovated a little bit more on some of the issues mentioned here, and others not mentioned.